Foot slap. Foot slap is a weakness of the dorsiflexors which produces a slapping sound as the forefoot hits the ground. This deviation occurs when the foot quickly drops into plantar flexion upon heel strike. The reason for this deviation is the inability of the dorsiflexor muscles to slowly control plantar flexion. It may also be a cause of injury to the common peroneal nerve. Distal neuropathy or hemiplegia can occur with this injury. High stepping gait, also known as steppage gait. The impairment for high stepping gait are marked weakness of the dorsiflexors, resulting in the foot dropping. This deviation would be noticed when the individual appears to be stepping over an imaginary obstacle, therefore the term high stepping. The reason for this deviation is in order to clear the foot from the ground, the hip and knee must be excessively flexed to advance the leg. Vaulting gait. Vaulting gait is the impairment of the lower extremity that reduces the ability to functionally reduce the length of the advancing limb. For example, the inability to flex the hip or knee will result in vaulting to clear the floor. This deviation occurs when the individual rises up on the toes of the stance foot to allow clearance for the contralateral advancing limb. The reason for this deviation is standing on the tiptoes creates extra clearance for the contralateral leg to clear the ground during the swing phase to advance. Weak quadriceps gait. Weak quadriceps gait is the weakness or avoidance of activation of the quadriceps muscles. This deviation occurs when the knee remains fully extended throughout stance, combined with excessive forward lean of the trunk. The reason for this deviation is with the forward lean of the trunk, this shifts the line of gravity anterior to the medial lateral axis of the knee. This maneuver mechanically locks the knee in extension. This reduces the need for activation of the quadriceps muscle. As a result, this gait deviation may stress the posterior capsule of the knee and potentially lead to genu recurvatum. Genu recurvatum. Genu recurvatum occurs with the excessive hyperextension of the knee during stance phase of gait. There are two reasons for this deviation. The first is the long-term paralysis of the quadriceps, which creates an overstretched posterior capsule of the knee. This may also involve paralysis of the knee flexor muscles, which fail to limit knee extension. The second reason for this deviation is a plantar flexion contracture. The lower leg deviates posteriorly relative to the ankle. This posture forces the knee into hyperextension, eventually overstretching its posterior capsule. Weak hip abductor gait, also known as Trendelenburg. This impairment is a weakness of the hip abductor muscles. There are two Trendelenburg deviations. The first scenario is the uncompensated response. During the single limb support, the pelvis leans to the side opposite of the weak hip abductor muscles. The reason for the uncompensated response is the hip abductors of the stance leg are unable to produce enough force to hold the pelvis level. The pelvis uncontrollably leans to the opposite side of the weak hip abductors. This is also referred to as the positive Trendelenburg sign. The second scenario is a compensated response. During the single limb support, the trunk and pelvis lean to the same side as the weak hip abductors. The reason for the compensated response is purposely leaning the pelvis and trunk to the same side as the weak hip abductor muscles. This compensation shifts the line of gravity closer to the axis of rotation of the stance hip. As a consequence, the external torque demands are reduced on the hip, thereby reducing the demands on the weak hip abductor muscles. Weak gluteus maximus gait. This impairment is the weakness of the hip extensors, such as the gluteus maximus. This deviation is the backward lean of the trunk during early stance phase of gait. The reason for this deviation is the leaning of the trunk posteriorly during the stance phase shifts the body's line of gravity posterior to the hip. This reduces the demands of the hip extensor muscles. Poliomyelitis is a common pathology for this impairment. Hip hiking gait. Hip hiking is the inability to functionally shorten the swing leg. For example, the weakness of the hip flexor muscles will result in a hip hiking gait. This deviation is the excessive elevation of the pelvis on the side of the swing leg. The reason for this deviation is with elevating or hiking the pelvis, it provides extra clearance for the advancing leg. This compensation maneuver often occurs with other maneuvers such as circumduction and vaulting. Hip circumduction. Hip circumduction is the inability to functionally shorten the swing leg. For example, reduced active or passive hip or knee flexion, or as a consequence of wearing a straight leg brace at the knee. This deviation is when the swing leg is advanced in a semicircular arc. The reason for this deviation is the circumduction creates extra clearance to advance the functionally long leg. This maneuver may place additional demands on the hip abductor muscles to help advance the swing limb.